The universe had been silent for a very long time. Not silent in the way a room is silent when people stop talking. Silent in the way a grave is silent, deep, heavy, and full of things that used to be alive. Humanity had been sending signals into that silence for over 300 years. Radio waves, laser pulses, mathematical sequences broadcast in every direction from every telescope and relay station ever built. 300 years of reaching out into the dark and hearing nothing come back. 300 years of wondering, debating, hoping, and slowly, quietly, beginning to accept the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, there really was no one else out there. And then, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in the month of March, the silence broke. It did not break the way the movies had always imagined it would. There was no massive ship appearing over a major city, no beam of light cutting down from the clouds, no dramatic broadcast interrupting every screen on Earth at once. It broke quietly, the way most truly important things do, in a small room, on a crowded instrument panel, noticed by one tired woman who almost missed it entirely because she was reaching for her coffee at the exact moment her board lit up. Meridian 7 was a deep space communications relay station parked in a stable orbit just beyond Jupiter. It was not a glamorous posting. The station was functional rather than beautiful. Long corridors of gray paneling, humming equipment bays, small personal quarters that felt slightly too small no matter how long you lived in them, and viewports that looked out at the same magnificent, unchanging view of black space and distant stars every single day until the magnificence started to feel almost routine. The crew of 12 had been out there for 14 months of an 18-month rotation, and the honest truth was that most of them were ready to go home. Chief Communications Officer Dana Reeves was 34 years old, originally from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, where the sky on clear nights was wide and full of stars, and where she had spent most of her childhood lying on her back in the grass staring up at them and thinking thoughts that her parents called dreaming and her teachers called distraction, and that she had always privately called paying attention. She had curly brown hair that she kept pulled back in a practical knot, dark eyes that noticed things quickly, a habit of chewing on the end of her stylus when she was thinking, and a coffee mug on her station desk that read, "Space is just really big," a gift from her younger brother that she had brought with her on every posting for the last 8 years because it made her smile every time she looked at it even when nothing else did. She had been running routine frequency checks that Tuesday morning, the kind of check she had run thousands of times before, scanning standard bands for signal drift and interference, the communications equivalent of making sure all the doors were locked. Her coffee was hot. The station was quiet. Her shift had 40 minutes left. And then something hit her board that was not routine. Not even slightly. It was a signal, weak, fragmented, arriving from a direction that Dana's instruments initially flagged as empty deep space, somewhere far beyond the outer edge of the solar system. The signal was not clean. It was broken up, partially degraded by distance and interference, like a voice trying to shout across a canyon in a windstorm. But it was there, and as Dana leaned forward and set down her coffee and started running it through the analysis filters, her heart began to beat faster, because what she was seeing on her screen was not random. It had pattern. It had rhythm and repetition and structure. The fundamental fingerprints of intelligence. It repeated in tight clusters of 3, separated by precise mathematical gaps, and the gaps themselves were not random either. They were proportional, structured, deliberate. Something had built this signal with intention, had designed it to be recognized as more than noise. And underneath all of that careful mathematical structure, underneath the clean and deliberate architecture of it, there was something else. Something that Dana could not have explained in technical terms if she had tried, something that lived in the feeling rather than the data. The signal felt desperate. Not in a word or a phrase that the translation filters could grab onto. It was not that clear yet, not that close to any human language. But desperation has a frequency of its own, and Dana Reeves had grown up paying attention, and she felt it the way you feel a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. In the body, before the mind has words for it. She sat completely still for approximately 5 seconds, staring at her board. Then she picked up the internal comm line and called Commander Hartman. Commander Joel Hartman was the kind of man who filled a room without trying to. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders, with gray spreading from his temples through the rest of his dark hair, and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough difficult things that nothing could make him flinch anymore, not because he had gone cold, but because he had learned that flinching wasted time. He had served in the Mars colonization program for 12 years before transferring to Deep Space Communications Command, and he had the quiet, settled authority of someone who had earned every single thing he had. He arrived at Dana's station in 3 minutes. She showed him everything without a word. He stood behind her and looked at her screen, and did not say anything for a long time, 47 seconds, which Dana counted because she needed something to focus on. Then he straightened up, looked out at the black through the viewport for just a moment, and reached for the secure priority line to Earth. "This is Meridian 7 to Unified Earth Command," he said. His voice was completely even. "Authentication code Delta 7 Ironside. Priority 1 transmission." He paused for just one breath. "We have first contact." The words went down the line at the speed of light, traveling the distance between Jupiter's orbit and Earth in approximately 43 minutes. And when they arrived, they landed the way a stone lands in still water. Not with an explosion, but with the beginning of rings that would spread outward and change the shape of everything they touched. Within 6 hours, every major government on Earth had been quietly notified. Within 12 hours, the first teams of specialists were already being pulled. Linguists who had spent careers studying the theoretical structures of non-human communication, mathematicians whose work focused on universal signal theory, xenobiologists who had published papers on the possible forms of non-terrestrial life. All of them called out of their beds and their offices and their university classrooms and told, in the most careful language available, that the thing they had spent their professional lives preparing for had just become real. Within 24 hours, the Global Response Center in Geneva was running at full capacity, and humanity, for perhaps the first time in its complicated, argument-filled history, was doing something together. Every nation, every faction, every political bloc that had spent decades disagreeing about nearly everything had been handed one fact that was larger than all of their disagreements, and for a short, remarkable window of time, they were all simply listening. The signal took 36 hours to fully decode. The linguists and the mathematicians and the AI translation systems worked in overlapping shifts, pulling apart the layers of it, mapping the mathematical structures onto known universal frameworks, building a translation bridge from nothing, and it was slow and difficult, and more than once it seemed like it might not work at all. But it did work, finally, in the early hours of the morning when most of the day shift had gone to catch a few hours of sleep, and a young mathematician named Dr. Songwei was alone with her screens and her third cup of tea. She stared at the decoded message for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the duty officer. The message said, in its entirety, "We are the Velhari. We are dying. Our enemies have taken everything from us. Our world is gone. Our people are almost gone. We have heard of your kind, small, young, fierce, stubborn, and we have debated for a long time whether to come to you. Many of us were afraid. Many of us said you were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to trust. But we have no one else. We ask only one thing. Protect us." Dr. Songwei read it a second time, then a third. Then she looked out the window of the Geneva Response Center at the pre-dawn sky, still dark, stars still faintly visible above the city lights, and she thought about the word dying, and she thought about the word only, and she thought about what it must have taken for a civilization that had clearly debated long and hard about whether to trust humanity to finally send that message anyway. And she thought, what kind of enemy makes a civilization that afraid? She did not have an answer. But the answer was already moving through the dark toward them, and it was arriving faster than anyone knew. 22 days after the signal, they came. The watching began the moment the first sensor array at the edge of the solar system registered something incoming, something large, moving on a trajectory consistent with the direction the signal had originated from, decelerating in a way that suggested not just travel but arrival, the deliberate slowing of something that intended to stop. Word spread through the monitoring network within minutes, and within an hour, every deep space telescope humanity had was pointed in the same direction. What they saw did not look like the arrival of an advanced civilization. It looked like the arrival of something that had barely survived. The ship was enormous. That much was clear even from a distance. But its enormity was not the clean, powerful enormity of a vessel built for speed and strength. It was the enormity of something that had once been great and had been broken, and the brokenness was visible in every line of it. Hull plates were missing in long, ragged gaps, stripped away by impacts or explosions, leaving the underlying structure exposed like bones through torn skin. One of the 4 main engine nacelles was completely dark, dead, trailing debris in a thin cloud that sparkled faintly in the distant sunlight. The other 3 engines burned with a pale blue light that flickered and stuttered, not with the steady confidence of a healthy drive system but with the uneven, desperate pulse of something running far past its limits on nothing but whatever scraps of power it could still generate. The ship moved slowly. Not slowly because it was being cautious. Slowly because slow was all it had left. General Maria Santos was in the war room of the Global Response Center in Geneva when the first detailed images came through, and she stood in front of the main display screen with her arms crossed and her jaw set and looked at that broken ship for a long time without speaking. She was 51 years old, originally from Sao Paulo, with short black hair and sharp dark eyes and the kind of face that had learned to show exactly as much as she wanted it to show and nothing more. She had spent 30 years in the Unified Earth Defense Force, working her way from a junior tactical officer on a Mars patrol cruiser to the head of the most powerful unified military organization in human history, and she had earned every promotion the hard way, by being better and harder working and sharper than everyone around her in every room she had ever walked into. She had spent her entire career planning for the possibility of alien contact. She had written papers on it. She had run simulations. She had argued in front of councils and committees for 30 years that humanity needed to be ready, not for diplomacy, not for trade, not for the peaceful, mutually beneficial first contact that the optimists envisioned, but for the whole range of possibilities, including the ones that were not peaceful at all. Now that it was real, she was not afraid. She was not excited. She was not paralyzed. She was thinking. "Life signs?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the screen. Her chief analyst, Eli Marks, was 29 years old, originally from Portland, with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes that had become permanent over the last 3 weeks, and a mind that processed data the way some people process music, fast, instinctively, finding the patterns before the conscious brain had finished asking the question. He was scrolling through incoming sensor feeds on 3 screens simultaneously, and he answered without looking up. "Faint," he said. Concentrated in what looks like a central survival module, sealed off from the rest of the ship. Maybe 400 individual biosignatures. He paused, checking something. The ship's internal structure suggests it was originally built to house somewhere in the range of 10 to 15,000. The room absorbed that quietly. 400 out of 15,000. Maria said nothing. She just kept looking at the broken ship on the screen and thought about what it meant to be one of 400. "Open a channel," she said. The translation systems that had been built and refined over the 3 weeks since the signal first arrived went to work immediately, and the communication that came back was slow and slightly uncertain, not because the Velhari were confused, but because translation between 2 completely alien languages in real time is an act of extraordinary difficulty that even the best systems can only approximate, but it was real, and it was clear enough, and what it said made Maria Santos feel something she had not expected to feel in this moment. She felt sorry for them. The Velhari did not look like anything humanity had imagined. They were tall, nearly 8 feet on average, with 4 arms arranged in pairs, skin that ranged in color across the population from deep ocean blue to something approaching silver in the older individuals, and large eyes with amber irises that seemed to gather and hold light rather than simply reflect it, giving them an expression that looked, to human eyes, permanently thoughtful. They moved with a natural grace that was clearly the product of a different gravity and a different evolutionary history, and their voices, even through the translation system, had a layered quality. 2 simultaneous tones, one low and one high, interweaving, that was deeply unusual and, once you stopped being startled by it, oddly beautiful. Their leader came to the communication channel personally. She gave her name as Sail, and she was old, ancient, really, in the way that only very long-lived species can be ancient, carrying 800 years of memory and experience in a frame that still stood upright and still spoke with a clear voice, though the silver of her skin and the slight tremor in all four of her hands spoke to the weight of those years. She had been, Dana Reeves learned later, the senior scientific minister of the Velhari civilization, the equivalent of a chief scientist and cultural archivist combined, someone whose job had been to preserve and advance the accumulated knowledge of her people. Now her job was simply to keep 400 of them alive. She spoke to General Santos through the translation interface with a directness that surprised many of the people in the room. They had half expected an advanced alien civilization to communicate in grand, sweeping philosophical terms. Instead, Sales spoke simply and plainly, with the exhausted precision of someone who no longer had the energy for anything except the truth. "We did not want to come here as beggars," she said. "That is important for you to understand. We watched your species for 100 of your years before making this decision. We studied you. We debated endlessly. Many of our surviving people argued against coming here at all, argued that you were too unpredictable, too aggressive, too young in your development to be trusted with the knowledge of our existence." She paused, and something moved behind her amber eyes that the translation system could not capture, but that Maria Santos, watching carefully, recognized as grief. "We came anyway because we had no choice remaining. Every other option was exhausted. Every other door was closed." "What happened to your people?" Maria asked. She kept her voice level and professional, but there was something underneath it, a human thing, an empathetic thing, that she did not bother to hide. Sale was quiet for a moment. "The Keth happened," she said. The name meant nothing to anyone in the room. No database, no historical record, no prior transmission in 300 years of listening had ever contained that word. Maria looked at Eli, who shook his head slightly. "Nothing in the system." "Tell me about them," Maria said. And Sale did. What she described over the next 2 hours, in careful, exhausted detail, while her broken ship limped slowly into the inner solar system and her 400 survivors rested in their sealed survival module, was not a civilization in any sense that humanity would have recognized. The Keth did not have territory they were defending. They did not have resources they were competing for. They did not have political goals or economic motivations or any of the reasons that had driven every war humanity had ever fought. The Keth destroyed because they chose to. Because they had decided, at some point in their history, a point so far back that even the oldest Velhari records could not find it, that the existence of other intelligent life in the galaxy was something to be ended rather than encountered. Not out of fear. Not out of competition. Out of something that was either profound philosophy or profound madness, and that from the outside was indistinguishable from either. They had ended 16 civilizations in the last 2,000 years. The Velhari had been civilization number 17. "How many of your people were there?" Maria asked. "Before." Sale's 4 hands folded together in a gesture that Tale would later explain was the Velhari expression for carrying an unbearable number.
"4 billion, she said.
The room went very quiet. "And now," Maria said. "You see our ship," Sale said simply. Maria nodded once. She looked at the broken vessel on the screen. She thought about 4 billion becoming 400. She thought about what that kind of loss felt like, not abstractly, but in the bone, in the chest, in the specific human place where grief lives. "How long before the Keth follow you here?" she asked. Sale closed her amber eyes. "They already know where you are," she said. "Our signal, the one we sent you, was detectable. They followed it. They will arrive in approximately 8 of your months." 8 months. Maria Santos looked at the number on the wall clock. She looked at her analyst. She looked back at Sale. "All right," she said, and her voice was completely steady. "Then we have work to do." The next 72 hours were the loudest humanity had been in living memory. Not loud with weapons or violence, loud with argument, which is the particular kind of loud that humans do better than almost anything else. The news of the Velhari's arrival and the Keth threat had been impossible to keep quiet past the first 12 hours, and by the time it became public knowledge, the reaction was immediate, overwhelming, and deeply, characteristically human. which is to say that within 48 hours of learning that a hostile alien species was 8 months away from arriving at their solar system with the explicit intention of destroying everything in it, humanity had managed to split into approximately 17 distinct factions with 17 distinct opinions about what should be done. Every parliament debated it. Every Senate voted on emergency sessions. Every council convened in extraordinary circumstances. News channels ran 24 hours of coverage, the panels on each channel arguing with each other and occasionally with themselves. Social media generated more content in those 72 hours than it typically generated in a month, and the content ranged from the genuinely thoughtful to the spectacularly unhinged, as it always does when humans are frightened and uncertain and processing something too large to fully hold. Outside the Global Response Center in Geneva, protests appeared within hours. Two groups, facing each other across the wide plaza in front of the main entrance, both passionate, both loud, both certain they were right, and both, in the way of all genuine human disagreement, containing people who were fundamentally motivated by the same underlying thing: love for humanity and terror of what was coming. One group carried signs that said, "Stand and fight. We don't leave refugees behind, and humanity is bigger than fear." The other carried signs that said, "Don't bring their war to our door," and "Protect Earth first." Both groups were scared. Both groups were right about something. Both groups were also, in different ways, missing something. That is usually how it goes. Inside the Global Council chamber, Prime Director Caleb Osei was doing his best to hold together a room that had every reason to fly apart. He was 60 years old, originally from Accra, Ghana, a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses that he was always taking on and off in the way of someone who has been doing paperwork for too many decades. He had spent his entire career in international governance, 35 years of navigating the complicated, fractious, exhausting business of keeping a unified but not always united Earth moving in roughly the same direction. He was not a military man or a scientist. He was a politician in the best sense of the word, a person who understood that governance is ultimately about getting imperfect people with conflicting needs to make decisions together, and who had the patience and the skill and the stubbornness to keep trying even when it seemed impossible. He had not slept in 3 days. His eyes showed it. His voice did not. For 4 hours, he sat at the head of the Global Council table and listened to 27 representatives argue. He listened to the security arguments and the humanitarian arguments and the strategic arguments and the emotional arguments and the deeply impractical arguments and the occasionally brilliant arguments, and he did not interrupt any of them because he had learned long ago that people argue harder when they feel they have not been heard, and that the fastest way to end an argument is not to shout over it, but to let it run until the people having it have said everything they needed to say. At the end of the 4 hours, he raised one hand. The room went quiet. Caleb took off his glasses, set them on the table in front of him, and looked around the room slowly before he spoke. "I want to ask everyone here one question," he said. "And I want you to sit with it for a moment before you answer, because I think it matters that we answer it honestly." He paused. "If it were us, if humanity were the ones running through the dark in a broken ship with 400 survivors and 4 billion dead, looking for someone still willing to open their door, what would we want them to say?" The room was very still. Nobody spoke for almost 30 seconds. Caleb nodded slowly. "Then I think we know what we have to do." But knowing what to do and doing it were separated by an enormous amount of difficult, urgent, complicated work, and the moment the political decision was made, that work began immediately. General Santos had already been preparing. She had not waited for the political argument to resolve. She had started making calls the moment the Velhari ship entered the solar system, because in her experience, the political argument always resolved eventually, and the time spent waiting for it was time that should be used for planning. By the time Caleb Osei's speech was finished and the council vote was recorded, Maria already had her key people in a room. 8 months, she said, standing at the front of a secure briefing room deep in the Geneva Response Center, looking at the 23 faces she trusted most in the UEDF. "Tell me honestly what we have, what we need, and what we can build." What followed was a 4-hour briefing that was one of the most sobering conversations of Maria Santos's career. Humanity's military capabilities were, in absolute terms, genuinely impressive. The Unified Earth Defense Force had spent a century building a fleet designed to protect the solar system, from asteroids, from rogue automated systems, from the kinds of intercolonial conflicts that had flared up twice in the last 50 years and been contained both times by the presence of a credible, unified force. The UEDF had 211 combat-capable vessels ranging from light patrol ships to heavy cruisers, weapon systems that could reliably engage and destroy anything in the human threat catalog, and a crew culture that was disciplined, skilled, and deeply motivated. Against the Keth, based on everything the Velhari data had provided, and the Velhari had provided a great deal of data, carefully preserved on the ship's still-functioning archive systems, humanity's fleet was strong, but almost certainly not strong enough. The Keth's weapons were of a higher energy class. Their ships were larger and more heavily armored. Their tactical coordination was described in the Velhari records as near-perfect, fleets that moved with the precision of a single organism, each ship responding to the overall battle state in real time with no apparent lag or communication overhead. The only thing that every analyst in the room kept coming back to, the one thing that showed up in every comparison, every simulation, every projection, was something that could not be easily quantified. Humanity's greatest military asset had always been the one that was hardest to measure: adaptability. Mid-battle, creative decision-making. The willingness to break a rule that wasn't working and try something that had never been tried before. The thing that humans did in the chaos of combat that no pre-programmed system and no rigidly disciplined force had ever been able to fully replicate. The thing that had won battles throughout history that every rational analysis said should have been lost. Then we build around that, Maria said. We do not try to out-armor them or out-energy them. We build a force that is faster, smarter, and more unpredictable than anything they have ever faced. She looked around the room. We have 8 months. Let's not waste a single day. What humanity built in those 8 months was one of the most extraordinary collective achievements in the species' history. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that gets written about in poetry or commemorated in art. It was too loud and too rushed and too unglamorous for that. It was night shifts and supply chain arguments and engineering failures at 3 a.m. and solutions found by exhausted people who had not been home in weeks. It was humans at their most fundamental, not graceful, not philosophical, not searching for meaning in the stars, just working, just building. With the particular desperate focused energy that humans generate when the alternative to building fast enough is too terrible to think about. Every shipyard in the human solar system ran without stopping. The orbital construction platforms above Earth, normally operating on 16-hour production cycles with regular maintenance breaks, were reconfigured to continuous operation within the first 2 weeks. Above Mars, above the asteroid belt installations, above the major moon colonies, the same shift happened everywhere simultaneously. Raw material that had been designated for civilian infrastructure projects was redirected. Supply chains that had been optimized for peacetime efficiency were restructured for wartime throughput. Tens of thousands of civilian engineers and construction workers who had been building power stations and habitat modules and transit infrastructure were offered contracts, generous ones because there was no time for anything but generosity, to come work on the war effort. Most of them said yes. Not all of them said yes because they were brave. Some said yes because they needed the money. Some said yes because they were curious. Some said yes because their friends were going and they did not want to be left behind. But some of them, enough of them, said yes because they understood what the choice meant and they made it anyway, and that is its own kind of courage that does not get called courage because it does not look heroic from the outside. Engineer Rosa Vega was 38 years old, originally from San Antonio, Texas, with short dark hair and oil-stained hands and a reputation in the UEDF engineering corps as the person you called when something was impossible. She was brilliant in the specific, practical way of someone who had spent 20 years solving problems that existed in the real world rather than on paper, problems with weight and friction and material fatigue, and the 100 small ways that things behave differently in practice than in theory. She had been home for exactly 3 days after a 14-month posting on the Jupiter shipyard when the call came. She had been sitting on her back porch drinking a beer and looking at her garden, which had grown completely wild in her absence and which she had been looking forward to fixing, when her phone rang with the priority code she had never actually expected to see in her lifetime. She went back the next morning. She was assigned to lead the retrofit program for the UEDF's mid-class cruiser fleet, 47 ships that needed to be transformed from competent patrol vessels into genuine frontline combat platforms capable of standing against a force that had destroyed 16 civilizations. The timeline she was given was 5 months. She told the officer who gave her the timeline that 5 months was not enough. He told her it was what they had. She told him she understood and went to work. She did not sleep more than 5 hours a night for the next 4 months. Her team was exceptional. She had handpicked them from across the engineering corps, choosing people not for their credentials, but for the specific qualities she had learned over 20 years to look for: the ability to stay calm when things went wrong and creative when the textbook ran out of answers. She had 37 of those people working under her, and she drove them hard, but never harder than she drove herself, and they knew it, and it mattered. In month 3, Rosa's team developed something that changed the entire strategic picture. They called it the Cascade Array. The concept had started as a theoretical idea from a paper Rosa had read 5 years earlier and mostly forgotten, a proposal for linking the weapon systems of multiple vessels through a synchronized firing network, allowing them to discharge simultaneously with precise coordination. The paper had been filed away as interesting but impractical because the synchronization required was beyond what the fleet's communication systems could reliably manage. Rosa had read it, found it interesting, and moved on. Now, under pressure, with 8 months and the survival of humanity as motivation, she pulled it back out and looked at it again. The Cascade Array worked by connecting a minimum of 6 cruisers through a dedicated high-bandwidth tactical network, synchronizing their targeting systems to a shared fire control AI, and allowing them to discharge a coordinated electromagnetic pulse that was not merely the sum of 6 weapons firing at once, but something qualitatively more powerful. A coherent wave that could collapse the power grid of a capital-class ship from 300 kilometers away, from outside the effective range of most counterweapons. No single ship could do it. The power requirements were too high, the synchronization too precise. But 6 ships, linked and coordinated, firing as one, that was different. It failed 17 times in the first round of testing. Rosa did not give up after 17 failures. She went back to the design each time, found the point of failure, fixed it, and tried again. Her team asked her, after the 13th failure, whether she thought it was going to work. She looked at them steadily and said, "Failure 13 means we've eliminated 13 wrong answers. We're getting closer." Test 18 worked perfectly. When Rosa presented the Cascade Array results to General Santos, Maria looked at the data for a long time. She looked at the power output numbers, the range calculations, the synchronization requirements. She looked at the simulations Rosa's team had run against models of Keth capital ships based on Velhari data. "How many can we build?" she asked. 12 complete arrays, Rosa said. "Possibly 14 if we pull components from the outer colony defense grids." Maria did not hesitate.
"Pull them," she said.
"And Rosa, this is remarkable work." Rosa nodded once. She was already thinking about the next problem. Meanwhile, on Meridian 7, Dana Reeves had been given a new assignment that she had not expected but had accepted immediately, to serve as the primary human liaison to the Velhari, specifically to work with the young Velhari physicist Tale, who was Sale's grandson and who had been assigned by Sale herself to serve as the Velhari's primary contact with the human team. Tale was young by Velhari standards, barely 80 years old, which Sale had explained translated roughly to the equivalent of a human in their late 20s in terms of life stage and development. He was slightly shorter than most of the adult Velhari survivors, with skin that was still the deep ocean blue of youth rather than the silver of his grandmother's age, and amber eyes that were very still and very watchful. He had been a physicist before, working in theoretical energy systems, the kind of work that was usually the quiet, patient work of a long lifetime of careful study. He had been 3 years into a research project that was supposed to take 40 years to complete when the Keth came. He did not talk about that very much. He did not talk about much of anything in the first weeks after arriving on Meridian 7. He ate what the station's food systems could adapt to meet Velhari nutritional requirements. He slept in the quarters that had been hastily reconfigured for him, and he spent most of his waking hours at the observation viewport, looking at Earth turning slowly below, the blue of the oceans, the white spiral of clouds, the thin bright line of the atmosphere at the edge of the disk, with an expression that Dana could not fully read but that she recognized, in some deep human way, as the expression of someone carrying something very heavy. She did not push him to talk. She had been raised by a father who believed that the best thing you could do for someone who needed to process something painful was to be present without demanding anything, and she understood, on an instinctive level, that the same thing was probably true regardless of what species you were. She brought him coffee once, knowing he could not drink it, just as something to do, a gesture of company. He looked at the mug for a moment, then at her, and something in his expression shifted slightly. "You are offering comfort," he said through the translation interface. It was not quite a question. "I'm offering company," Dana said. "There's a difference." He thought about that for a moment. "Explain." "Comfort says everything's going to be fine," Dana said. "Company says I'll sit here with you whether it's fine or not." Tail looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at Earth. "My people debated for 6 months about whether to send the signal," he said quietly. "Many of them genuinely believed that your species was too dangerous to contact, that you would either be unable to help or would add to the danger." He paused. "My grandmother overruled them. She said that the Velhari had spent 800 years being perfectly cautious and carefully rational, and that it had cost them everything, and that if there was any lesson to learn from that, it was that sometimes you had to stop calculating and simply trust." Dana was quiet for a moment. "She sounds remarkable." "She is the most remarkable person I have ever known," Tail said simply. Then, after a pause, "I hope we were right to trust." "So do I," Dana said honestly. Over the following weeks, Tail began, slowly and carefully, to share what he knew about the Keth. He shared it not in formal briefings or structured data transfers that came later, but in the way that knowledge often moves most usefully, through conversation, through questions asked and answered, through Dana sitting at the viewport beside him in the evenings and asking about things and listening carefully to the answers. What emerged from those conversations was a picture of the Keth that was both more and less terrifying than the raw data suggested. More terrifying because the Keth were genuinely alien in a way that went beyond biology. Their motivations were not comprehensible in any framework of self-interest or survival, and fighting an enemy whose motivations you cannot understand is more frightening than fighting one whose goals you can at least map. Less terrifying, in a specific and important way, because Tail understood something about them that the Velhari records had captured, but that required a physicist's precise mind to articulate clearly. "The Keth are powerful," Tail told Dana one evening, 8 weeks into their partnership. "Technologically, militarily, they are far beyond what the Velhari were, and your people have not reached Velhari levels yet in most areas. In a direct comparison of weapons and ships, they are stronger." He paused, looking at Earth. "But they are also, in one specific way, rigid." "Rigid how?" Dana asked. "They have a method," Tail said. "It has worked 16 times. They do not deviate from it, because it has never needed deviation. They attack in 3 waves. The first wave tests, it probes defenses, measures response times, identifies strongest points. The second wave uses what the first wave learned to break the strongest points. The third wave destroys whatever remains." He looked at Dana. "Every civilization the Keth has fought has broken in the second wave. Not because they ran out of weapons or ships. Because by the second wave, hope was already gone. They had seen too much, lost too much. And the Keth are very good at making the loss feel total before it actually is." Dana sat with that for a moment. "So, the key is the second wave," she said. "The key is what happens inside the defenders during the second wave," Tail said precisely. "The Keth do not win with firepower alone. They win with despair." Dana was quiet for a long time after that. She thought about human history. She thought about every battle humanity had ever fought where the outcome should have been obvious and was not, where someone had held on past the point of rationality, past the point where giving up would have been the sensible choice, and had changed the outcome not with superior weapons but with something harder to quantify and impossible to destroy. She went to her desk and wrote a message to General Santos. It said, in its entirety, "The Keth's real weapon is despair. We cannot let hope break." Maria Santos received the message at 6 in the morning. She read it twice. She printed it out, walked into the war room, and taped it to the wall above the main display screen. It stayed there for the rest of the 8 months. Everyone who walked into that room saw it. Nobody ever took it down. They came without warning. Not without the kind of warning that sensors provide. The monitoring network at the solar system's edge had been upgraded extensively over the last 8 months, and it screamed the moment the first Keth ship dropped into detection range. But without warning in the human sense. No communication, no signal, no declaration or ultimatum or demand. The Keth did not announce themselves. They did not explain their intentions. They arrived the way a storm arrives. Not because it is angry at you, not because it has any feeling about you at all, but simply because it is what it is, and it goes where it goes. It was the 47th week of preparation. Dana was aboard the U.S. Ironwall, the new command cruiser that General Santos had chosen as her flagship, a vessel that had been built from the keel up during the preparation period, specifically designed to serve as the battle network hub for the Cascade arrays and the Caro system that was still 3 weeks from completion when the alarms hit. Dana had requested the transfer to the Ironwall herself, knowing the battle was coming and wanting to be at the center of communications when it did. Tail had come with her, because by that point there was no practical separation between Tail's work and Dana's work. They had become, without quite planning to, the most effective human-Valhari partnership in the fleet. Dana was at her station running a communication systems check when every alarm on the ship went off simultaneously. She was on her feet before the sound had fully registered, already reaching for her board, already scanning the incoming data. Tail, who had been sitting at the secondary station running frequency analysis on Keth communication patterns, the quiet, obsessive work he had been doing every day for months, looked up immediately, his amber eyes very still. "They're here," Dana said. Tail looked at her screen. He did not respond for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Yes." The main display in the Ironwall's command center filled with contacts, and even for people who had been preparing for this moment for months, seeing the actual numbers in actual real time produced a physical reaction that preparation could not fully prevent. 63 contacts. 63 Keth warships dropping into detection range in a tight, disciplined formation, moving with a smooth and terrible precision that was immediately, unmistakably different from anything human fleets did, not because it was faster or more aggressive, but because it was perfect. No variance in spacing. No adjustment period. Every ship in exactly the right position, moving at exactly the right speed, as if the fleet were a single machine rather than 63 individual vessels. General Santos was on the command deck before the third alarm had finished sounding. She was in full uniform, which meant she had slept in it, which she had been doing most nights for the last 3 months because experience had taught her that the moment you got comfortable was the moment the situation changed. She stood at the front of the command deck, hands clasped behind her back, and looked at the 63 contacts on the main display with the steady, evaluating attention of a person who has been waiting for exactly this and is not surprised to see it. "Battle Formation Omega," she said into the fleet channel. Her voice was completely calm, not the forced calm of someone suppressing fear, but the natural calm of someone who had made their peace with the situation weeks ago and was now simply operating in it. "All Cascade arrays, hold your positions and hold your fire until my explicit command. I say again, do not fire until my command. All other units, assume defensive formation and stand by." She paused for exactly 1 second. "This is the moment we have been preparing for. Every person in this fleet is here because they are the best at what they do. Trust your training. Trust each other. Trust the plan." Across 211 ships spread across the solar system, crews moved to battle stations. In the survival quarters of a Valhari ship, still parked in high Earth orbit, still barely functional, its flickering engines barely managing station keeping, Sail sat with her 400 survivors and watched the feed that Tail had set up for her on a small screen. She watched the human fleet organize itself, watched the Cascade arrays slide into their prepared positions, Watch the 211 human ships align themselves in the formation that General Santos had designed and drilled into the fleet's muscle memory over the last 6 months. Sale had watched 16 civilizations face the Keth from the outside, through records and testimonies. Now she was watching it from the inside, and the two experiences were very different. The 16 civilizations she had watched in the records had all had something in common, something that was visible in retrospect, in the data, in the way their fleets moved and their communication sounded in the moments before the first wave hit. They had all been afraid in a way that showed. Not afraid in the body. Every defender was afraid in the body, and that was natural and healthy and did not matter. Afraid in the formation. Afraid in the gaps between ships, the slight loosening of the line, the individual vessels that drifted fractionally out of position as if the pilots were already halfway thinking about the route of retreat. She watched the human fleet. The line was tight. The formation was solid. The ships held their positions with a steady, planted quality that she had seen in exactly one other context in 800 years of life. She had seen it in people who had made up their minds. The first Keth wave hit 63 minutes after arrival. It came as a wall, a coordinated, multi-vector assault across the entire front of the human formation, plasma strikes and kinetic rounds and focused energy beams arriving from different directions simultaneously, each strike precisely calculated to test a different defensive layer. The Keth first wave was not designed to destroy, it was designed to measure. To see how the defenders responded, how fast, how accurately, how flexibly. To find the places where the line bent most under pressure. To collect the data that would make the second wave lethal. 3 human ships were destroyed in the first 90 seconds. The impacts were direct, precise, and catastrophic. The Keth first wave was a probe, but even a probe with Keth weapons was devastating. 5 more ships took severe damage. Hull breaches, engine failures, weapon systems going offline. The human fleet did not scatter. Not a single ship broke formation. The return fire was accurate and heavy, the 8 months of preparation showing in the quality of the gunnery, the speed of the targeting solutions, the coordination between adjacent ships covering each other's arcs of fire. The Keth first wave probed and found the line harder and more organized than any of the 16 previous civilizations had managed. And 40 minutes in, the accumulated data from the cascade array positions was telling General Santos exactly what she needed to know. The Keth were committing to their standard first wave approach vector. Tail psychology was holding. Arrays, Maria said quietly. Stand by. She watched the targeting data come in. She watched the Keth formation tighten into the attack geometry she had been waiting for. She gave it another 60 seconds, letting the geometry lock, letting the commitment deepen, letting the Keth first wave invest itself fully in the approach that led directly through the array kill zones. Then she said, Arrays, fire. 12 simultaneous pulses of focused electromagnetic force rolled through the void without sound or light in the human visual spectrum, invisible, instantaneous, and devastating. 4 Keth capital ships went dark immediately.
Not damaged, dead.
Power grids completely collapsed, every system offline, engine stopped, weapons silent. They drifted in the formation like stones suddenly dropped into a river, and the ships around them had to adjust, and the adjustment broke the perfect Keth geometry for the first time in 2,000 years of warfare. And the Keth fleet did something that no recorded Valhari observation had ever documented. It hesitated. 47 seconds of hesitation, which is nothing in human terms and everything in combat terms. Dana was counting. General Santos was counting. Tail, at his station, was counting too, and his hands were pressed flat on his console, and he was barely breathing. 47 seconds. Then the second wave came. The second wave was not like the first wave. The Keth abandoned their standard formation completely. The tight, geometric precision of the first wave dissolved instantly, replaced by something that was harder to describe and far more dangerous, a fluid, multi-directional assault that was not chaotic but rather adaptive, each of the surviving 59 Keth ships acting with sudden, individual aggression while still maintaining an overall coherence that should have been impossible without constant communication overhead. They came from different vectors simultaneously, at different speeds, their attack patterns shifting and adjusting in real time in a way that made every pre-calculated defensive position suddenly less useful than it had been 60 seconds before. It was, by any objective measure, a staggering display of military capability. And the human fleet met it with the one thing the Keth had never encountered before, the one quality that every analyst and every commander and every message taped to a war room wall had been trying to distill and preserve and build around for 8 months. Human chaos management. Which sounds like a contradiction, but is not. Human chaos management is not the ability to eliminate chaos. It is the ability to function inside chaos, to make fast decisions in incomplete information environments, to adapt tactics in real time without losing the overall picture, to feel the shape of a battle shifting and respond to the shift before the analysis is finished. It is a skill built from 10,000 years of the particular kind of warfare that humans have always fought, against enemies and terrain and weather and their own supply lines, and it is genuinely different from anything that can be pre-programmed or drilled into a system, because it relies on something that lives in the gap between thinking and acting, in the place where instinct and training meet. Across the solar system, 208 human ship commanders, 3 had been lost in the first wave, made decisions. Decisions that were not in the plan. Decisions that deviated from formation, broke protocol, improvised, adapted, and that were also, underneath the improvisation, deeply informed by 8 months of training and by the specific culture that General Santos had spent her career building in the UEDF. A culture that said your judgment matters, that said when the plan stops working, your mind is the plan, that said the best officer in a crisis is the one who knows the rules well enough to know exactly which one to break. Captain James Okafor of the UES Relentless was 30 years old, young for a cruiser command, a fact that 3 of his superior officers had mentioned when his promotion came through and that he had responded to by being the best prepared, best drilled, best organized commander in his task group, which was the only answer worth giving. He was originally from Lagos, with close-cropped hair and a scar on his chin from a training accident in his second year in the academy that he had refused to have cosmetically removed because he felt the reminder of falling down and getting back up was worth keeping. He had a reputation in the fleet for a particular quality that was difficult to name precisely, something like steadiness, but more active than steadiness. The quality of a person who, in the worst moment, becomes more focused rather than less. When the second wave hit, Okafor's ship took a direct strike to the starboard engine assembly that took out half his propulsion and dropped his weapons systems to 40% capacity. In the 3 seconds that followed, his tactical display showed him 2 things: a Keth destroyer bearing down on the center line of the human formation at a speed that would bring it through in 90 seconds, and 2 smaller human vessels on a flanking approach that could complete a devastating strike on that destroyer in exactly 93 seconds, 3 seconds too late, because the destroyer would already be through. Unless something was in the way. Okafor did not call Santos for permission. There was no time to call Santos for permission, and he did not need permission. He needed 3 seconds, and he had a ship, and he made the decision the way all the best decisions in combat are made, completely, immediately, and without looking back. He took his crippled cruiser and drove it broadside into the path of the Keth destroyer. The collision warning screamed. His crew, some of the best people he had ever served with, did their jobs in those 3 seconds with a speed and precision that he would think about for the rest of his life. Every damage control system in the ship was activated before the impact. Every non-essential system was cut to redirect power to hull integrity. His pilot, Lieutenant Kishan Deo, a 26-year-old from Nairobi who had graduated top of her class and who flew a damaged cruiser the way most people drove a car in a parking lot, put the Relentless exactly where it needed to be. Not in the destroyer's path in a way that would destroy them both, but at an angle that created maximum obstruction with minimum catastrophic damage to the cruiser's structural core. The impact was massive. It rang through the whole ship like a bell struck by a hammer. Okafor was thrown sideways into his console and came back up bleeding from a cut on his forehead that he did not notice for the next 40 minutes. But the Keth destroyer's approach was deflected by 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. The 2 flanking human vessels completed their strike. The destroyer lost its engine assembly and began to drift. Okafor held his position and counted his crew. 23 of them did not answer. He held those 23 names in a specific, careful place inside himself, not pushed away, not allowed to overwhelm him, just held, the way you hold something precious and fragile when you are in a situation where you cannot yet give it the care it deserves. He would sit with them properly later. Right now, there was still a battle. Relentless to fleet, he said, his voice completely level despite the blood on his face and the damage screaming through every system in his ship. We are mobile and operational. Back in formation. General Santos heard his voice in her earpiece and permitted herself 1 second of something, not quite pride, because pride was too small a word for it, before she moved her attention back to the whole picture. Because the whole picture had a problem. The outer ring of the human formation was under enormous pressure. 3 task groups had taken severe damage and were beginning to compress inward, the defensive line in that sector bending visibly. It looked, from most perspectives, like the beginning of a collapse. Santos, we're losing the outer ring, Eli Mark said from her left, his voice controlled but tight. If we don't reinforce. Don't reinforce, Maria said. Eli turned to look at her. Let the outer ring fold, Maria said. She was watching the overall battle picture with a specific, focused attention. Not looking at individual ships, not tracking individual engagements, but reading the shape of the whole thing, the way a chess player reads a board not piece by piece, but as a complete position. It needs to look like a collapse. Make sure those units know they are retreating with discipline and direction, not scattering. Directed retreat, toward the center line, at exactly the speed I'm transmitting now. Eli looked at her screen, looked at the numbers, then looked at her. The Keth will pursue, he said. Yes, she said. They'll think the line is breaking. Yes, she said again. And then, Maria looked at the 12 reserve cruisers sitting silent and dark at the positions she had placed them in 3 days ago, far off the main formation, powered down to minimal emissions, invisible on Keth sensors. And then they'll find out it wasn't, she said. While the second wave raged through its second hour, Tail noticed something. He had been monitoring the Keth fleet's communication frequencies on a secondary station. The quiet, methodical work he had been doing for months, building up a detailed map of Keth's signal patterns the way a linguist builds a map of an unknown language, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, until the structure begins to emerge from the noise. He was not, strictly speaking, assigned to do this. Nobody had thought to assign him to it. But Tail was a physicist with a physicist's relationship to patterns, and the Keth communication frequencies had patterns that he had been studying with patient, focused attention for as long as he had been on the iron wall. During the chaos of the second wave, with alarms screaming and the ship shuddering periodically from near-miss impacts and every screen showing a different piece of a battle that was simultaneously going better and worse than the plan had predicted, Tail sat very still and looked at something on his secondary screen and felt the bottom of his stomach drop out. He reached for Dana's comm channel immediately. Dana, he said, his voice quiet and very controlled in the way that Velhari voices went quiet when something was seriously wrong. Not louder, not more urgent in tone, but more precise. I need you to open a direct channel to General Santos.
Right now.
This is not a request. Dana had learned, over months of working with Tail, to hear the difference between Tail being thorough and Tail being alarmed. She had this channel open in 2 seconds.
Go, she said.
I've been monitoring the Keth command frequency for 6 months, Tail said, speaking fast now, his translator keeping up, but barely. I know its patterns. I know what the standard operational communication looks like. What I am looking at right now on this frequency is not standard operational communication. The signal volume is wrong. The directionality is wrong. They are not communicating with the ships we can see. He paused for 1 beat. They are communicating with ships we cannot see. Dana had the General Santos channel open before Tail finished the sentence. General Santos, this is Reeves, Priority 1, Velhari Intelligence. She kept her voice flat and fast and clear. Tail has detected Keth command communications indicating a second fleet element not currently visible in our sensor picture. The first fleet is bait. Tail believes the second fleet has been holding position outside our detection range, waiting for us to commit and reveal our full capabilities. The war room on the iron wall went silent. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of comprehension, which is much colder. Maria Santos looked at the battle picture. She looked at the retreating outer ring units, which were in the middle of her carefully designed directed retreat maneuver. She looked at the reserve cruisers sitting dark and ready at their positions. She looked at the clock. Then she said very calmly, "All units, this is Santos. Halt the outer ring maneuver. All units reverse to full defensive formation. I say again, full defensive formation, all positions. Cancel reserve activation. Cascade arrays, stand down from secondary fire positions and redistribute to perimeter coverage." She paused for one breath. "We have intelligence suggesting a second Keth fleet element. We are resetting to full perimeter defense. Move." The fleet responded instantly because 8 months of drilling had built exactly the kind of responsive, disciplined force that could receive a complete change of orders in the middle of active combat and execute it without hesitation, confusion, or argument. The outer ring units stopped their retreat and began fighting back toward their original positions. The reserve cruisers began repositioning. The cascade arrays reconfigured. The retreating Keth First Fleet, which had been pursuing the directed retreat with the precise, confident aggression of a force that believed it was watching a defense collapse, suddenly found the collapse reversing. The human line reformed. The Keth pursuit slowed, recalculated. And then from beyond Jupiter's orbit, dropping out of a sensor shadow created by the gas giant's electromagnetic interference with the calculated precision of something that had been positioned there from the very beginning, the second fleet arrived. 112 ships. They came out of the shadow in a tight formation, and even on the iron wall sensors, even rendered as blue symbols on a tactical display, they communicated a kind of mass and weight and certainty that was physically uncomfortable to look at. 112 fresh ships against a human fleet that had been fighting hard for 7 hours. Even Maria Santos went still for a moment. It was Eli Marks who broke the silence. His voice was unsteady, the first time it had been unsteady in 7 hours, and he was not ashamed of it. "General," he said, "what do we do?" Maria looked at the 112 contacts on her screen for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked at the message taped to the wall above the main display. "We can't let hope break. We do what we came here to do," she said. And her voice was completely steady. In the Velhari survival quarters in high Earth orbit, Sale had been watching everything. She had watched the first wave arrive. She had watched the cascade arrays fire, had seen, for the first time in 2,000 years of Keth warfare, a Keth fleet hesitate, and something in her 800-year-old chest had moved at that moment, moved in a way she had not expected and could not fully name. She had watched the second wave, and she had watched the human fleet do something extraordinary. Not beat it, not destroy it, but survive it, adapt to it, hold its shape under pressure that should have broken it. Because she had watched 15 other civilizations face the Keth second wave, and she knew with the precision of long experience exactly what that pressure looked like and exactly what it did to a defending force when the hope started to drain. The hope was not draining. She had watched for it carefully, with the diagnostic attention of a scientist and the sad wisdom of a survivor, and it was not happening. The human fleet was losing ships, taking damage, bleeding resources, but the human fleet was also making decisions, covering gaps, adapting to the changing shape of the battle with a creative, practical, alive quality that she had never seen in any defending fleet in any record she had ever studied. And now she had watched the second fleet arrive. She sat with that for a moment. 112 ships. And she looked at the human fleet on the tactical feed, battered, 200 ships instead of 211, hull breaches and damage systems flagged across dozens of vessels, and she did her own calculation. It was not a good calculation. Her 400 survivors sat around her in the survival quarters, the scientists and engineers and children and elderly who were the last of 4 billion, who had survived by pure luck and the hard choices of the people who had gotten them to this ship. They were frightened. They had been frightened for 3 months, and they were tired of being frightened. Some of them were watching the tactical feed. Some of them could not bring themselves to watch. Sale stood up. She was 800 years old, and she had been the most senior intellectual figure of the Velhari civilization, and she had spent 400 of those years making careful, rational, precisely reasoned decisions, and she had watched every one of those careful, rational decisions fail to prevent the end of her world. She looked at her people. "I want to speak to everyone," she said. They gathered, all 400 of them, in the largest open space in the survival quarters, which was not large enough for comfort, but was large enough for this. They came because Sale had asked, and because she had 800 years of authority and 800 years of earned trust, and because in a situation where everything else was uncertain, she was the one fixed point. She looked at them for a moment before she spoke. "We are 400, she said. "I am not going to tell you that 400 is not devastating because it is. I am not going to tell you that what we have lost was not irreplaceable because it was. I am not going to tell you that this is not one of the darkest moments in the history of any civilization, because it is."
She paused.
"But I am going to tell you something else. Right now, in the space between here and Jupiter, there are 200 human ships that are fighting a force they were not built to fight. They are fighting it because 8 months ago, they said yes when we asked for help. They said yes knowing it might cost them this. They said yes anyway." The room was completely silent. "Our ship has one thing still functioning at full capacity," Sale continued. "The drive core. We cannot fight. We have no weapons, and we have almost no power. But we can move." She looked around the room. The Keth Second Fleet is approaching from a vector that puts them directly behind where the human reserve formation is currently positioned. If our ship moves into that space, uses the pre-war Valhari hull alloy, which the Keth sensors cannot read through, as a blind barrier, we can give the human fleet a sensor shadow to reposition behind. Time to reorganize. Time to deploy the weapon system they have been holding in reserve. She paused. "It is dangerous," she said simply. "If the Keth engage us directly, this ship cannot survive it. Our hull will not stop their weapons. We are not offering a shield in the military sense. We are offering time. And time, in this battle, is what the humans need most." One of the survivors, a young woman named Vey, barely 20 Valhari years old, who had been a student before the Keth came, raised her hand. "What if they engage us directly?" she asked. Her voice was not angry or afraid. It was simply asking. "Then we end the same way 4 billion others did," Sale said. "But we end doing something. Choosing something. Which is different from waiting." Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then, Vey nodded. One by one, the rest of them nodded too. Sale sent a message to Tail through their private frequency, soft and layered, speaking in the tones of her native language that the translation system was not involved in, something just between grandmother and grandson. "The ship still has its drive core," she said. "We are moving into the gap. Tell your Dana. Tell her Santos needs to know to watch for the sensor shadow." Tail received the message at his station on the iron wall, and for exactly 3 seconds he sat completely still with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes closed. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Dana. "My grandmother is moving the ship," he said. His voice was steady. "She is putting it between the Keth Second Fleet and the human reserve formation. The hull alloy will create a sensor blind spot. She is giving Santos the time she needs to deploy Caro." Dana looked at him for a moment. Tell Santos," he said. Not urgently, quietly, with the specific, anchored calm of someone who has already made peace with something. Dana told Santos. Maria Santos received the information and said nothing for 2 seconds. Then she said, "Extend full sensor coverage to the Valhari ship and alert me the instant any Keth vessel targets it." She looked at the tactical display. She watched the broken, flickering Valhari ship begin to move. It moved slowly, not with speed or power, but with the patient, deliberate dignity of something ancient that has decided what it is going to do, and is doing it. It crossed the space between its orbital position and the tactical gap with aching slowness, engines flickering, hull plates still missing in long strips, the scars of 3 months of survival visible in every line of it. And it parked itself, with quiet precision, exactly where Sale had calculated it needed to be. The Keth Second Fleet's advance slowed. Their sensors were, as Tail had predicted, unable to see through pre-war Valhari hull alloy. The alloy composition was a specific combination of materials that the Keth's sensor architecture had a known blind spot for, a blind spot the Keth had never bothered to correct because no surviving civilization had ever had access to that alloy in any useful form. The blind spot lasted 17 minutes before the Keth found a workaround. 17 minutes. Maria Santos used every single second of those 17 minutes. She had been saving Project Caro for exactly this. Not because she had planned for this specific scenario. She had not known about the Second Fleet, had not known about the sensor shadow, had not planned for a broken alien ship to buy her 17 minutes of maneuvering time with the last working component it had. She had been saving Caro because Caro required something very specific that the battle had not provided until now: a pause. Not a long pause, just enough to redistribute and align, enough to breathe, enough for every ship in the fleet to be given the same moment of stillness that the system required. Project Caro was not a weapon in any traditional sense. It was a network. Specifically, it was a distributed, AI-assisted tactical targeting architecture that connected every human ship in the fleet simultaneously, sharing sensor data, targeting solutions, fire control calculations, and threat assessments in real time across the entire force. When Caro was active, the fleet did not fight as 200 individual ships making 200 individual firing decisions. It fought as a single entity, with 200 sets of sensors all feeding into one targeting picture and 200 weapon systems all receiving fire solutions from one integrated intelligence. The concept had existed in theoretical papers for 20 years. The execution had been the barrier, the communication bandwidth required, the latency issues, the interference problems, the almost impossibly complex software architecture needed to make 200 ship systems talk to each other in real time under combat conditions. Rosa Vega had been given the problem in month 4 of the preparation period, after the Cascade Array project was mature enough to hand off to the installation teams, and she had taken one look at the theoretical paper and said, "This will be the hardest thing I have ever done." Then she had started doing it. It had failed 17 times in testing. Each failure was different, a different point of collapse, a different component of the architecture breaking down under the load. Each failure taught Rosa something, and she rebuilt each time with more precision and more stubbornness, because stubbornness was not always a virtue, but in this case, it was the exact quality the problem required. Test 18 had worked perfectly, but Caro had a requirement that went beyond the technical. It required every ship in the fleet to surrender autonomous targeting control to the network for 60 seconds. 60 seconds of relinquishing the instinctive, self-preserving independence that every combat pilot and every combat commander carried as naturally as they carried their training. 60 seconds of trusting not just the system but every other ship in the fleet simultaneously, trusting that the targeting solutions would be right, that the network would not fail, that the 60 seconds of vulnerability would not be the 60 seconds the Keth chose to make their decisive strike. It required, in the most literal possible sense, absolute trust. Maria had never activated Caro in battle because the battle had not given her the stillness it required. Every moment of the last 8 hours had been too fluid, too pressured, too actively dangerous to ask 200 ship crews to surrender their targeting systems to a network that had been tested exactly once. But she had 17 minutes. And she had spent 8 months building a fleet that trusted her. She opened the fleet-wide command channel. "All units, this is Santos." She kept her voice at exactly the level she wanted it. Not dramatic, not rushed, not anything that would transmit fear or urgency in a way that would make the ask harder. Just clear and steady and present. "We are activating Project Caro. Authorization code Ironwall 7 final. Effective immediately, surrender targeting control to the network. Every ship. No exceptions." She paused for one beat. "We have 17 minutes. The network needs 90 seconds to synchronize. The Keth Second Fleet is 112 ships, and they're coming for us. Caro is what we have. Trust each other.
Trust the plan.
Confirm activation." Across the fleet, the confirmations came in. They did not all come instantly. There were a few seconds, a human pause, the half-second of every person's instinct asking, "But what if something goes wrong?" And then the confirmations began, one by one, and then in clusters, and then all at once, 200 voices saying yes in different words, 200 ships handing their targeting systems to the network with the particular, specific, deliberately chosen courage of people who understand exactly what they're doing. Rosa Vega, sitting in the engineering bay of the UES Resolute, a damaged cruiser 300 kilometers from the Iron Wall, where she had been helping repair a Cascade Array component and had simply stayed when the battle started because there was no better place to be useful, heard the confirmations come in through her earpiece, one by one, and pressed both hands flat on the console in front of her, and closed her eyes and said very quietly, to nobody in particular, and to the universe in general, please work. Please work. The network synchronized in 83 seconds. The Velhari Hull Alloys blind spot lasted exactly 17 minutes and 4 seconds before the Keth found their workaround. And in that moment, the moment the Keth sensors came back online and the Second Fleet accelerated back into its assault formation, Caro fired. Not one ship at a time. Not in a sequence or a wave. All of them. 200 human ships discharged simultaneously, every weapon on every ship firing in the same instant, all of it directed by the Caro targeting architecture at the precise structural nodes of the Keth Second Fleet's formation, the specific ships whose positions held the formation together, whose destruction or disabling would cause the entire coordinated structure to fracture into individual, uncoordinated vessels. The discharge was silent in the vacuum of space, which is how all weapon discharges are in space. Silent, because there is no air to carry sound. But on every screen in every ship in the human fleet, the effect was instantaneous and total. 31 Keth warships went dark or broke apart in the first 4 seconds. The Keth formation shattered. Not fractured, shattered. The coordinated, geometrically perfect assault formation that had been the core of Keth military superiority for 2,000 years broke into pieces, and each piece was suddenly not part of a unified force, but a collection of individual ships, and individual ships, however well-armed and well-crewed, are fundamentally different from a unified fleet with perfect coordination. And the human commanders knew the difference between fighting one and fighting the other. Caro deactivated after 60 seconds, as designed, and every ship got its targeting autonomy back. And the human fleet, 200 individual commanders with 200 individual minds and 200 individual judgments, took the broken remnants of the most feared military force in the known galaxy apart. The battle ended 9 hours, 43 minutes, and 17 seconds after the first Keth weapon fired. The surviving Keth vessels withdrew. Not in panic. There was something cold and deliberate even in their retreat, the same absence of emotion that had characterized everything they did, as if even the decision to leave was made without anything resembling feeling. They gathered their survivors, broke into small groups, and accelerated away from the solar system on diverging headings, carrying their data and their dead. They did not send any communication. No message, no signal, no acknowledgement of what had happened. They simply left, the way a storm simply leaves when it has spent itself, without explanation or apology. The solar system was quiet again. For the people aboard the 200 human ships that remained, the quiet arrived like a physical thing, settling over the fleet like a change in air pressure, something you could feel in your body before your mind fully processed what it meant. For a few seconds, across 200 ships, there was simply silence. Not the silence of waiting or the silence of tension. The silence of something enormous having ended. And then, slowly, the silence filled back up, with voices checking in, damage reports, medical calls, systems assessments. The practical, urgent, unglamorous work that follows a battle, and that is in its own way as hard as the battle itself, because it is the work that makes the cost visible. The casualty reports came in across the next 6 hours. 67 ships destroyed. 49 more so severely damaged they would never be operational again. 116 total vessels lost from a fleet of 211. Every ship that was still capable of movement was damaged to some degree. Hull breaches, weapons offline, engine systems compromised, life support running on backup power. The human dead numbered 11,412. Each number was a name. Each name was a person. Each person was a whole universe of relationships and memories and unrealized futures, people who had said yes, who had suited up, who had shown up, who had done their jobs with skill and courage and had not come home. Parents, children, partners, friends, people from every nation on Earth and from the Mars colonies and the outer stations, speaking hundreds of languages and carrying hundreds of cultures, united in the end by the one thing they had chosen together. Commander James Okafor sat alone in his command chair after the Relentless stood down from battle stations. The ship around him was quiet, Damage control teams moving through the corridors, repair work beginning on systems that could be repaired, and inventories being taken of systems that could not. His bridge crew were at their stations, giving him space, understanding without being told that he needed it. He sat with the names of his 23 for a long time. He did not try to process them quickly or move past them efficiently. He sat with them the way they deserved to be sat with, fully, slowly, letting the weight of each one register completely. Lieutenant Deo had already told him that she was going to be fine, that her injuries were not serious, that the ship was holding together. He was grateful for that in a way that went very deep. But the 23 were gone, and being a commander meant sitting with the gone ones in a way that did not minimize them or rush past them. He would write letters to their families when he got back to his quarters. He always wrote letters personally. Some commanders had templates. He did not believe in templates for this. General Maria Santos stood in the war room of the Iron Wall and received the casualty numbers one by one as they came in, and she did not allow herself to go numb to them. She had made that decision decades ago, that she would never use the commander's traditional emotional distance as a way to avoid the full weight of the cost, because the commanders who went numb to cost became commanders who spent lives too easily, and that was something she refused to become. She felt every number. She would feel them for the rest of her life. That was the price of the authority she carried, and she paid it fully. Rosa Vega was in the medical bay of the Resolute having a burned hand wrapped. She had not noticed the burn until 3 hours after the battle ended, because the adrenaline and the work had been thorough enough to make it invisible, when the final Caro performance report came through on her tablet. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the synchronization data, the targeting accuracy, the network performance under actual combat load. Test 18 had been a prototype demonstration. This had been a real battle. The performance was better than the test. She put down the tablet. She looked at the burned hand being wrapped. She thought about 17 failures. She thought about Test 18. She thought about 200 ships saying yes all at once. And then, in the medical bay of a damaged cruiser with a burn on her hand and a concussion she had also not noticed until someone pointed it out, she cried, quietly, briefly, with her face turned slightly away from the medic, in the specific way of someone who is not comfortable crying in front of people, but cannot quite stop it from happening. She would deny it if asked. Nobody asked. Dana Reeves sat next to Tail in the observation room of the Iron Wall, and they watched Earth turning below them in the silence, after everything. It was still there. Still whole. Still impossibly, stubbornly beautiful. The blue of the oceans and the white of the clouds and the thin bright line of atmosphere at the edge of the disk, exactly as it had been before any of this started. "We did it," Dana said. Her voice was quiet and a little rough. Tail nodded slowly. "Your grandmother's ship," Dana said. "Is she alive?" Tail said. "All 400. The hull held. The drive core held." He looked at his hands on the console for a moment. "She will tell me it was a logical tactical calculation. That she analyzed the hull alloy properties and the sensor blind spot characteristics and determined the probability ratios were acceptable." He looked at Dana. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing genuine is simple in its aftermath. The battle had been a single event, contained, definable, with a beginning and an end. What came after was not an event but a process, and processes are slower and messier and require more patience than events, and the world was not always patient. There was mourning, first. Real, public, global mourning, the kind that fills plazas and parks and broadcast channels, the kind where strangers cry next to other strangers because the loss is large enough to belong to everyone. 11,412 names were read aloud in a ceremony that lasted 4 days. Not quickly, not as a list, but as individual people, each name followed by 10 seconds of silence, 10 seconds to let the weight of one specific person's absence register before moving to the next. It took 4 days. Nobody thought it was too long. Many people thought it was not long enough. Then there were arguments about what came next, about the Keth, whether they would return, when they would return, how humanity should prepare for their return, whether the victory had bought time or simply delayed the inevitable. About the Velhari, what humanity owed them, what the Velhari could contribute to a rebuilding civilization, whether the 400 survivors should be given permanent residence in the solar system, or whether there was a path toward helping them rebuild somewhere of their own. About the signal that Dana had caught, and the possibility that other civilizations were out there, and whether humanity's answer to the Velhari was the beginning of something, or just a single chapter. These arguments were loud and sometimes ugly and occasionally brilliant and entirely human, and they went on, as arguments do, for months. But underneath them, something had settled. Prime Director Caleb Osei gave the speech that defined the period not on the day after the battle but 3 weeks after it, when the morning had completed its first cycle and the arguments had found their footing, and the world was ready to hear something more than grief or celebration. He gave it in Geneva, from the same chamber where he had asked his one question 72 hours after first contact. He had written it himself, at his desk, alone, at 3 in the morning, with the city dark and quiet outside his window, and a cup of tea going cold beside his keyboard. He had written it 5 times, throwing away the previous versions each time because they were too formal or too political or too careful. The version he gave was the one that said what he actually believed in the language he would actually use. "We were asked for help by people who had every reason to be afraid of us," he said, standing in the chamber without notes, because the speech he had written was inside him well enough by now to not need paper. "They came to us with nothing left, no world, no fleet, no certainty of any kind that we would not make things worse. They came because they had run out of every other option, and because one person, one remarkable, 800-year-old person who had seen too much loss to afford to stay cautious, decided to trust us anyway." He paused. "We did not answer that trust perfectly. We argued and we debated and we made mistakes during the preparation, and we paid a cost that is real and heavy and that we will carry for the rest of our history. But we answered. We showed up. We stood in the way of something that has ended 16 civilizations, and we said, not with words, but with ships and people and 11,000 lives, we said, not here, not these people, not today." He looked around the chamber. "I want to make a promise today. Not a political promise, not the kind that goes in a treaty or a resolution or a policy document, though those things will follow. A simpler kind of promise. The kind you make by saying it out loud and meaning it, and letting the meaning be witnessed."
He stopped.
"From this day forward, of SYMJHY, the answer to any civilization that comes to us in the dark, that comes to us broken and afraid and out of options, will be the same answer it was this time. We will stand with you. We do not promise to win. We do not promise to be without cost. We promise only to show up and to fight and to not let you face the dark alone. Because that is what it means to be humanity. Not fearless, not perfect, not invincible, but present, willing, here." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then it was not. Sale watched the speech from her quarters in the orbital residence that had been prepared for the Velhari survivors, comfortable, carefully adapted to Velhari needs, with viewports that looked out at Earth. She watched Caleb Osei speak, and she watched the chamber respond, and she folded all 4 of her hands together in the Velhari gesture that means "I see you fully and I am grateful," the gesture that is reserved for moments of the most profound acknowledgement, the moments when words are not large enough. She held that position for a long time after the speech ended. Tale watched it with Dana at the secondary communications station on Meridian 7, where they had both been temporarily reassigned while the iron wall underwent repairs. He watched his grandmother's gesture on the feed from the orbital residence, and something in his face changed, shifted from the careful, watchful stillness he had worn for most of the months Dana had known him to something more open, more vulnerable, more present. "She has not done that gesture since before the Keth came," he said quietly. Dana looked at him. "What does it mean exactly?" Tale thought about it for a moment. "It means I was right to trust. It means there is still something worth carrying forward.
It means," he paused.
"It means she feels, for the first time in a very long time, that the future is not just the absence of the past." Dana nodded slowly. Rosa Vega watched the speech from a rehabilitation room at the Geneva Medical Center, where she was treating a shoulder injury she had acquired during the battle and had not dealt with promptly enough. As her doctor had pointed out with some feeling, She watched it on a screen propped on the bedside table, with her arm in a brace, eating hospital food that was not good, and she felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since the night she had cried in the Resolute's medical bay. She was not a person who used words like meaning very often. She was an engineer. She dealt in systems and loads and material properties. But she understood, watching the speech, that what she had built, the arrays, the Caro network, the 10,000 small solutions to the 10,000 small problems of the last 8 months, was part of something larger than the sum of its parts, and that being part of that was its own kind of answer to the question she had not known she was asking. General Santos did not watch the speech. She was in a planning meeting. Because the Keth had retreated, but they had not surrendered, and they had not communicated, and they had spent 2,000 years destroying civilizations without once stopping because one civilization managed to survive their first visit. Maria Santos had no way of knowing whether the retreat was permanent or temporary. The analyst's best estimate was temporary. Her own instinct agreed. She was already planning the next 8 months. Not with fear. Not even with the particular weight of the last 8 months, though that weight was real, and she still felt it. With the steady, forward-looking attention of someone who has proven something important to themselves, not that winning is guaranteed, but that winning is possible, and that the difference between the two is the quality of the preparation and the courage of the people doing the preparing. She stopped, just once, before she walked into the planning meeting. She stopped in the corridor outside the war room and looked through the window at the message that was still taped to the wall above the main display. "We can't let hope break." She looked at it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she walked into the meeting. 3 months after the battle, Dana Reeves went back to Meridian 7. She had requested the transfer herself, and the request had been approved without difficulty, partly because Dana had spent the last 3 months being exactly the kind of person who gets what she asks for when she asks for reasonable things, and partly because the Meridian 7 posting was still important, possibly more important now than before, since the possibility of additional alien contacts had moved from theoretical to operationally realistic, and someone needed to be there paying attention. Tail came with her. He had been offered a formal position, the first Velhari to hold any kind of official role in a human organization, Senior Xenological Liaison to the Unified Earth Deep Space Communications Corps, a title that the Corps had invented specifically for him because no existing title was adequate. Sale had approved the posting with a nod and a comment that she would expect regular reports. Tail had promised to provide them and had suspected, correctly, that she would read every word. They arrived at Meridian 7 on a Tuesday, which Dana had not planned but found appropriate. The station looked the same. The long gray corridors, the humming equipment bays, the viewports opening onto the enormous quiet of space. The crew was different. Most of the crew she had known had rotated out. The new crew knew who she was, which was slightly uncomfortable, because 3 months of public coverage had made Dana more recognizable than she had ever wanted to be, and she had spent most of those 3 months deflecting attention that she felt belonged more accurately to the 11,000 dead, and the 200 crews that had held the line, and the engineers who had built the tools that made it possible. She unpacked her quarters. She set her coffee mug on her station desk, the one that said "Space is just really big," and she looked at it for a moment and thought about how different the joke felt now that she knew just how many things were living in all that space. On their first evening back, she was doing routine frequency checks. Old habits. Some old habits are worth keeping. She had been at it for 40 minutes, running through the standard bands, checking for drift and interference, the comfortable procedural rhythm of work she had done thousands of times, when something registered at the far edge of her board sensitivity range.
Faint.
Very faint, almost drowned out by background radiation and distance. She would have missed it if she had not been paying exactly the right kind of attention, the kind she had been paying since she was a child lying in the grass in Ohio, looking up at the stars. She isolated it, ran it through the filters, watched the analysis output build on her screen.
Pattern.
Rhythm. Repetition in clusters of 3. Mathematical gaps. Her hands went completely still on the board. She sat for a moment with the signal, just sat with it, feeling it, the way she had felt the first one on that ordinary Tuesday in March, what felt like a lifetime ago. And underneath the mathematical architecture of it, underneath the structure that said intelligence, there was that thing again. That quality that lived in the frequency rather than the data. That thing she had described to Commander Hartman as fear, the thing she had been right about. Someone was afraid. Someone was reaching out. She looked up. Tail was at the viewport looking at the stars the way he often looked at the stars in the evenings, not searching exactly but not resting either. Just present with them. His amber eyes reflected the light of distant suns that were so old their light had left them before humanity existed. Tail, she said. Her voice was quiet. He turned immediately because he had learned, over months and a battle and everything that had come after, to hear exactly what Dana meant in exactly the way she said things. He crossed the room and looked at her screen. He looked at it for a long time. The distance is enormous, he said finally. The signal is very degraded. I know, Dana said. It will take weeks to fully decode. I know. It may be from a species with no shared mathematical framework at all. The translation could take months. I know, Dana said, and turned to look at him. And while all that is happening, there is someone out there who is afraid and reaching out in the dark, and they don't know yet whether anyone is going to answer. Tail held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Dana reached for the secure priority line to Earth. She settled into her chair, touched the familiar controls, and held the familiar posture of a person who has done this before and is completely certain about doing it again. This is Meridian 7 to Unified Earth Command, she said. Authentication code Delta 7 Ironside. Priority 1 transmission. She paused for the space of exactly one breath. We have another signal. Unknown origin, unknown species, unknown distance. The pattern is intelligent. The message is not yet decoded.
She stopped.
Someone else is out there, and they're afraid, and they need help. She released the transmit key. She waited. The response came in 43 minutes, the speed of light from Jupiter's orbit to Earth and back, exactly as it had always been. 43 minutes of silence in which Dana and Tail sat together at the observation viewport and looked at the stars and did not say much, because there was not much that needed to be said. The response was not long. It was the voice of the duty officer at Unified Earth Command, a young man by the sound of him, professional and clear and, underneath the professional clarity, carrying something that Dana recognized and that she was glad to hear, the particular quality of a person who already knew, before the words finished forming, exactly what the answer was going to be. Meridian 7, this is Earth Command. Signals acknowledged. Analysis teams are being assembled. Ambassador Sale has been notified per standing protocol.
A pause.
And Dana, the duty officer's voice dropped its formal register for just one moment, the way voices do when the official message and the human message need to share the same channel. Tell whoever's out there we hear them. Another pause. Tell them we're coming. Dana exhaled slowly. She looked out the viewport, at the black, at the billion silent fires of the stars, at the incomprehensible depth of the universe that was no longer quite as quiet as it had been a year ago, and that she suspected would be less quiet still in the years and decades ahead. She thought about the Velhari and the Keth and the battle and the 11,000 names that had been read over 4 days. She thought about Sale folding 4 hands in the gesture that meant I was right to trust, and about Tail saying the word courage in a new language, trying it out to see how it fit. She thought about Rosa Vega and her 17 failures and her test 18. She thought about James Okafor driving a crippled ship broadside into a Keth destroyer for 4 seconds that changed the battle. She thought about all of it, the cost and the courage and the terrible weight and the genuine, specific, irreducible fact that at the end of it, 400 people who had been the last of 4 billion were still alive, and the blue planet below was still turning, and the stars were still there, and whatever was out in the dark reaching through the silence with a frightened signal in clusters of 3 was going to hear a voice come back. We hear you. We're coming. She thought about how those 4 words contained everything. Not a guarantee of winning. Not a promise of easy answers or safe passage or certain outcomes. Just the one thing that mattered. The one thing that costs everything when you mean it and costs nothing when you don't. The one thing that had been the difference between 16 dead civilizations and one that was still alive in a broken ship with 400 people who had stopped waiting for certainty and started trusting. Presence. Willingness. Here. The universe had been silent for a very long time. It was not silent anymore. And somewhere in the dark, Something afraid and reaching was about to find out that the answer it had been searching for, the answer it barely dared to hope was possible, was already on its way. Because humanity had answered once. And HFY, from this day forward, humanity would keep answering. For as long as there were stars to listen. And there were so many stars. White heavy checkmark, end of story.